We're using a technique called Google Style Emphasis LeavePOut cross-validation Google Style to test a machine learning model. It's a way to split our data into training and testing sets to see how well the model generalizes. Break time 300 milliseconds. I have a dataset with 10 data points. I want to evaluate my machine learning model by creating many different training testing sets. In each evaluation, I will leave out exactly 3 data points for testing, and the rest will be used for training. Break time 300 milliseconds. We are working with a small dataset containing only 10 samples. This will influence the number of training testing splits we can create. Break time 300 milliseconds. I need to figure out how many different training testing splits I can make and how many data points will be in each training set. Break time 300 milliseconds. This statement says the number of iterations, or the number of times I split the data, will be less than 120. We will need to calculate to check this. Break time 300 milliseconds. This is about the number of data points used for training in each iteration. If I start with 10 samples and leave out 3 for testing, the statement claims that I'll have 7 samples left for training. Break time 300 milliseconds. This statement suggests the number of samples for training will be fewer than 7 in each iteration. Break time 300 milliseconds. This states that we can make exactly 120 different training and testing data splits. Break time 300 milliseconds. This is the problem setup. We're using a technique called say as interpret as characters LeavePOut say as from the say as interpret as characters scikit-learn say as library in Python. It's a way to split your data into training and testing sets in all possible combinations. Break time 300 MSWE have 10 data points and for each split, I'll leave out exactly 3 for testing. Break time 300 milliseconds. The goal is to find out how many different ways I can make this split and how many data points are in each training set. This simply tells us the total number of samples data points in our data set. It's 10. This number is crucial for calculating the number of iterations in LeavePOut cross-validation. This is the multiple choice question that I will answer using information provided in the problem and the calculations based on the given context. Break time 300 milliseconds. We need to determine which statements are correct about the number of times the LeavePOut method runs iterations and the size of the training datasets it creates. We're evaluating a machine learning model using scikit-learn's say as interpret as characters LeavePOut say as cross-validation. We have 10 data points, and say as interpret as characters LeavePOut say as will divide them into training and testing sets repeatedly. Break time 300 milliseconds. Specifically, say as interpret as characters LeavePOut 10. P3 say as means we'll leave out 3 data points for testing in each iteration. I calculate the total number of ways to choose 3 data points out of 10 to leave out for testing. This is a combination problem. 10 choose 3, which is 1 0 9 8 3 2 1 1 2 0. Break time 300 ms. That's 120 different ways to create the test sets. Therefore, there will be 120 iterations. This is incorrect because my calculations show there are exactly 120 iterations. If I start with 10 samples and remove 3 for testing, then 7 samples remain for training in each iteration. Pretty simple, right? This is wrong. Each training set will have 7 samples, as I just explained. This is a technique Google Style name excited. I use Google Style in machine learning to evaluate my models. I divide my data into different training and testing sets. Making sure Google style name emphatic, I use all possible combinations. Google style, it helps Google style name calm me get a reliable estimate of my models. Performance Google style. Here, Google style name conversational, I am specifically using Google style scikit-learn's LeavePOut function. N10 means Google style name emphatic, I have 10 data points Google style in total. P3 means in each iteration. Google style name emphatic, I leave out 3 data points Google style for testing. I have a dataset with Google style name emphatic 10 samples Google style, that's my starting point. Google style name calm, I calculated the total number of ways to choose 3 samples out of 10 for testing. Google style using combinations 10, 3, 7. I get 120 possible ways or iterations. This statement is Google style name excited correct. Google style, my calculation shows exactly 120 iterations. This statement is also Google style name excited correct. Google style, since I start with 10 samples and leave out 3 for testing. Each training set has 1 3, 7 samples. LeavePOut creates Google style name emphatic multiple training testing splits Google style, that's its key feature. Each split is a different iteration. In each iteration, my training set will contain 7 samples. This Google style name lively means Google style we're using a specific Google style name emphasis scikit-learn Google style technique to test our machine learning model. It's called say is interpret as characters LeavePOut say is cross-validation, which cleverly divides our data into training and testing sets in many different ways. Break time 300 milliseconds. This tells you how much data we have. Say is interpret as characters 10 say is samples to work with. That's the entire pool of data well used to build and assess our model. I am using say is interpret as characters LeavePOut say as with 10 total samples N10. And I'll leave out 3 samples for testing P3 in each trial. It's like shuffling a deck of cards and repeatedly dealing out 7 cards for practice, then setting aside 3 for testing each time. This is Google style name strong incorrect Google style. Break time 300 milliseconds. The calculations show there are exactly 120 different ways to select the testing sets of 3 data points from the 10 we have. This one is Google style name strong correct Google style. Break time 300 ms since I start with 10 samples. After leaving 3 out, 3, 7 samples remain for training in each iteration. Break time 300 milliseconds. This is Google style name strong incorrect Google style. I explicitly leave out only 3 for testing, therefore I'll always use 7 for training. This is Google style name strong correct Google style. Break time 300 milliseconds. We calculate the number of different training testing splits as 10 factorial divided by 3 factorial times 7 factorial. That simplifies to 1098, 321, 120. Break time 300 milliseconds. That's a large number of training and testing iterations. I am using scikit-learn say is interpret as characters LeavePOut say is break time 300 ms cross-validation. It's a clever technique to split data for model evaluation. Break time 200 ms it systematically leaves out a set number of data points for testing in each iteration. Break time 200 ms. Think of it as trying out your model many times with different test sets to assess performance. I have a dataset with 10 samples and I want to evaluate my machine learning model using say as interpret as characters LeavePOut say is cross-validation. Break time 200 ms in each round of evaluation. I'll leave out exactly 3 samples as a testing set. Break time 200 ms. The goal is to figure out the total number of evaluation rounds and the number of Samples in the training set for each round. I need to calculate the total number of times my model will be trained and tested in this say as. Interpret as characters LeavePOut say as scheme. This is equivalent to figuring out how many ways I can choose 3 samples from 10 to leave out. For testing, I find there are 120 different ways to create training and testing sets. This is determined by calculating the number of combinations of choosing 3 samples out of 10. 3, 7, 1, 2, 0. This is the number of iterations. I need to determine how many samples will be available for model training in each iteration. Because I start with 10 samples and leave out 3 for testing, each training set will contain 7 samples. 1, 0, 3, 7. This option is incorrect because my calculation shows exactly 120 iterations. This option is incorrect because each training set has 7 samples, not fewer. I am using scikit-learn's say as interpret as characters LeavePOut say as cross-validation. It's a technique I use to evaluate how well my machine learning model performs. I split my data into different training and testing sets, and it systematically leaves out a certain number of samples for testing in each iteration. Break time 300 milliseconds. Pretty cool. Huh? I have a dataset with 10 samples. Think of samples as individual data points like individual customer profiles or medical records. Break time 300 milliseconds. It's the data I am using to train and test my machine learning model. This tells me I am specifically using say as interpret as characters LeavePOut say as with 10 samples. N10. And in each iteration, I leave out 3 samples for testing P3. Break time 300 milliseconds. The N and P are parameters controlling the cross-validation process. Since I have 10 total samples and leave out 3 in each iteration for testing, I have 7 samples left for training my model in each iteration. 1, 0, 3, 7. Break time 300 milliseconds. These are my training sets. I calculated 120 iterations using the combinations formula 10, 3, 7. This calculates all the possible ways I can choose 3 samples out of 10 to leave out for testing. In simpler terms, how many different ways can I pick 3 samples from a group of 10? Break time 300 milliseconds. The answer is 120. This is a multiple choice question testing my understanding of the say as. Interpret as characters LeavePOut say as cross-validation strategy. I need to figure out the number of iterations and the size of training sets. This statement is true. My calculation shows exactly 120 iterations. Break time 300 milliseconds. It's the correct answer. This statement is also true. In each iteration, I use 7 samples for training, 10 total samples, 3 testing samples, 7 training samples. Break time 300 milliseconds. Another correct answer.